All right, so yesterday Matt Walsh released a bit on pharmaceutical ads, and I'm going to be reacting to it as a doctor who used to work for the pharmaceutical industry and also for the FDA. I've done a couple of these before, and yes, guys, I can read the comments. You don't like it when I react to Matt Walsh, and people think I'm a MAGA doctor over here. But I have to tell you that he seems to be the only one out there who's actually talking about corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. So say what you want about him. I'm not hearing anything from other people. And so I do think it is important to cover him. So with that put aside, let's go in and check this out.
So what is it about the pharmaceutical industry specifically that makes them so hard to criticize? The leading theory, which we've talked about before, is that companies like Pfizer have basically bought the media.
Okay, so to provide some context on what he's talking about a scandal that happened with Pfizer 2 years ago where one of their high-level executives was talking about doing some illegal research on the COVID vaccine and how it simply wasn't covered. And so he starts this bit by saying, why aren't pharmaceutical companies often blasted by the media when they're caught doing things that are wrong?
I mean, you can't watch Fox or CNN or MSNBC without seeing an ad from the pharmaceutical industry. In total, the pharmaceutical industry spends something like $5 billion in advertising every year, which...
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right? You know, why would any mainstream media outlet want to compromise that $5 billion that's coming to them for pharmaceutical ads? I mean, they're literally on all the time. Like if you're ever I don't watch TV, but every time I go to a bar and I'm seeing sports games and things like that, I always see at least 3 or 4 ads. And so this is a huge amount of revenue for these companies. They're not going to talk. They're not going to say negative things about the drug. It would hurt the bottom line.
In some years is more than they spend on research and development. And a lot of this spending is concentrated on news stations. As the journalist Kyle Becker reported on his Substack, nearly 31% of ad minutes on major nightly news broadcasts in 2024 came from pharmaceutical brands. Wow. Now, if you watch any amount of cable news, you know that figure is certainly accurate. I mean, you could turn the television on and you'll probably see one of these ads within like 5 minutes, if not sooner. And these are among the most lucrative ad purchases, pushing drugs like Ozempic, Skyrizi, and so on. And naturally, that kind of spending leads to favorable coverage. Big Pharma doesn't even need to establish any kind of quid pro quo officially or request anything from the news networks. It's just generally understood that if you're working for one of these networks, you should go easy on the pharma giants because they are one of the reasons you're in business.
Yeah, so that's, again, super obvious why that would make sense. But let me tell you something that's also interesting. This doesn't just happen with cable news. This is happening with academic medical centers. I mean, the leadership at these places, they take in so much money from pharmaceutical companies to run their clinical trials. They're also going to shy away from saying anything negative about it, lest it disrupt the money coming to their institutions and the advancement of their career. So it's also happening to the doctors that are training other doctors, you know, the leaders in academic institutions. Other places this happens as well is medical journals. Big medical journals out there, they make a lot of money from pharmaceutical companies, either in ads that are put there or by reprints. So for instance, you know, when, you know, a big journal, American Journal of Psychiatry, something like that, they publish a clinical trial that a pharmaceutical company has done. The sales team from the pharmaceutical company, they buy thousands and thousands of copies of these things, essentially giving revenue to the journal so they can give it to their sales team and hand it out. And it means that the editors over there are going to shy away from covering controversial things about the drugs because that's going to damage their relationship with pharma and it's going to disrupt their funding. And so you sort of see how the money, you know, the billions of dollars these folks have sort of like trickles down and it starts to corrupting all of the people that should have our best interests in mind. You know, essentially independent medical journals, academic psychiatrists, and the media. And because of the money, it's been totally corrupted.
Now, this dynamic is one of the reasons why a lot of people took notice recently on hearing the news that RFK Jr. and the HHS had supposedly implemented a total ban on direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising.
Good.
And those reports turned out to be inaccurate, at least for the time being. But RFK Jr. has pledged to implement a similar ban in the past, and he's been very clear about his reasoning. While he was campaigning for Trump last year and while he was before that leading his own presidential bid, RFK Jr. made the point that pharmaceutical advertising has compromised the news industry.
Yes.
And he's also said that in part because of these advertisements, Americans spend far more on prescription drugs than pretty much every other major country. By some estimates, we spend more than twice as much. And it's logical to conclude that advertising plays, a major role in those numbers. When people see an advertisement for a new prescription drug, they're more likely to tell their doctors they want it, as opposed to a cheaper generic brand. And keep in mind, only 2 countries on the planet allow direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, and those countries are us, the United States, and New Zealand. The vast majority of the civilized world, the rest of the world has rejected this kind of marketing. And one of the obvious consequences of this carve-out for Big Pharma is that they sell a lot more drugs to people who otherwise wouldn't pay for them.
That's exactly what's going on, and herein lies the problem. When the government allows drug companies to aggressively market, I think you said it was like 33% of cable news coverage to the population, you're going to get a lot of people asking for drugs. And it's so subtle. It's the amount of pharmaceutical marketing has completely recast how Americans, and I would say many people around the world, even look at mental distress. For instance, in the past, people would say things like, why am I so anxious? Why am I depressed? What's happening in my life? What's happening in my relationships? What's happening at work? Is there something about the way I'm sleeping or the food that I'm eating or the way I'm living that's wrong? Similarly, if there was some kind of grief in a person's life, but, maybe they moved away from their hometown and they got lonely or they lost a loved one, in the past, people would say, yeah, that's normal. That's what happens when you get unhappy. But for the last 3 decades, not only have we been bombarded with messaging saying you may have a chemical imbalance and ask your doctor if you're depressed, we've also had disease-mongering campaigns out there where drug companies will pay academics or sometimes even celebrities, like I think Adam Levine from Maroon 5 did all the adult ADHD stuff, to go and raise awareness about the severity of these conditions. And we've completely allowed them to recast how we see suffering. And for instance, ADHD is now this quirky neurodivergent thing. And there's all these campaigns out there saying, oh, you're just not living up to your true potential. This could lead to a car crash, or you could get in a divorce because you're just not performing and you're not concentrating enough. It raises the awareness about the disease and then talks about all the downsides and says nothing about the harms of the drugs. And so you get this lopsided messaging that has essentially convinced, so many people to go and get on these meds. We have 20% of women taking antidepressants these days, women who are more emotional by nature because it's protective. It allows them to look after children and attend to social relationships more. That's completely normal for them. We've convinced 20% of women out there that these fluctuations in their mood and their emotions are pathologic and that they need to numb them out so they can be in a pretty capitalistic sort of world. And it's just so messed up. And that's the consequences of allowing this kind of advertising to take place.
They wouldn't spend $5 billion a year on advertisements if that weren't true. And this isn't even getting into Big Pharma advertisements and solicitations that target physicians and other professionals. So that's a whole other category. We're talking just about direct-to-consumer marketing. Now, just to give one example, in 2022, the manufacturer of the drug Skyrizi, AbbVie is the name of the manufacturer, spent around $229 million advertising the drug just that year alone. The next year, AbbVie decided to increase its advertising budget for the drug by more than double, and the results were clear. Drug sales went up to $7.8 billion, and that's an increase of roughly 50% year over year. Now, there was no major FDA approval that occurred in this period. The drug's formula didn't change in some way. Instead, more people heard about it, so more people asked their doctors for it. And by the way, the vast majority of these $7.8 billion came from customers in the United States because they're pretty much the only people who are being subjected to these advertisements. This advertising exemption, of course, is just one of several carve-outs that Big Pharma enjoys in this country. It's also nearly impossible to sue them if, for example, one of their vaccines ends up hurting or killing you, thanks to a federal law passed 3 decades ago. But the advertising carve-out is one of the most important ones because it has a lot of downstream effects that aren't immediately obvious. One of those effects is that the ads increase the price of the drugs. When billions of dollars are spent on advertising, inevitably that cost is going to be passed on to the consumers. This is just basic economics and common sense, and doctors see it every day. As far back as a decade ago, when direct-to-consumer advertising was much less common than it is today, the American Medical Association noticed the problem. They voted to ban all direct-to-consumer advertising, and the chair of the AMA, a woman named Patrice Harris, announced that, quote, "Today's vote in support of an advertising ban reflects concern among physicians about the negative impact of commercially driven promotions and the role that marketing costs play in fueling escalating drug prices. Direct-to-consumer advertising also inflates demand for new and more expensive drugs, even when these drugs may not be appropriate," close quote.
Wow, how tight, how times have changed. If only we had medical leadership like that now. Unfortunately, so many of them, these academics are sort of on the gravy train for pharma, and they would never say things like that. And I mean, here's the issue, right? Why are we allowing drug companies to market to people? Like, shouldn't drug companies simply educate doctors about the products and let doctors prescribe them? Well, that would be the ethical way to do this. But the drug companies have figured out that if they run all of these ads and patients ask doctors for them, doctors are likely to prescribe them. And that's because we're in this messed up situation now with the insurance-based system where family doctors spend about 7 minutes of FaceTime with someone. And if someone comes in and they say, "Oh, can I have this medication?" they're really busy and they know it's going to make the patient happy. And so if the patient just asks about it, they end up putting them on a drug that may not be beneficial for them. I know that's an awful thing to say, but that's kind of the way medicine is right now. You know, the doctor says, "Oh, well, FDA approved, that should be fine." We have huge amounts of people on drugs that they shouldn't take. And this is a nuanced topic, right? I mean, some people out there should be on medications, even antidepressants, antipsychotics, and benzos. But it's like overdone by a factor of about 20 because we've got so many people out there just asking for these things and the doctor's just giving them away in these transactional visits instead of actually reserving them for the people where everything else has failed. That's how we should be doing psychiatry. No psychiatric meds for life stresses, divorce, loneliness, poverty. Why would you paper over those things with drugs that have uncertain long-term benefits? You should only give them to people who, the symptoms are coming out of nowhere. They've tried lifestyle interventions, dietary interventions, psychotherapy. If all of that has failed, you can give them medications. But because we're super transactional in the way we do these things now, we just give these drugs out to people who are going through divorce or are lonely or they're in places of poverty. It's so wrong. And that's the consequence of allowing this type of pharmaceutical marketing.
Now, it's true that by law, these advertisements have to list all of the potential side effects. Invariably, they rattle them all off at the end of the commercial, as we all know. And they do it so quickly that you can't really tell what's happening in some cases. Pretty much everyone ignores these disclaimers at this point because they all end up sounding like a bizarre list of horrible afflictions, always ending in death or paralysis or something catastrophic. You can watch an ad for Claritin and they'll tell you that the side effects could include getting hit by a train or something. It's almost as if the drug makers have trained us to become numb to all of these potential side effects and to think that they're all extremely rare and unlikely to occur. So you just kind of block them out of your mind. And that's because even with the often comically long disclaimer at the end of these drug commercials, the ads still don't do enough to emphasize the potential side effects and dangers of these drugs. They don't discuss the relative risk of every side effect or how common they are. And that makes sense because ads, regardless of who's making them, are meant to manipulate and to create an emotional response in a very short period of time. And that's fine when you're selling cars or clothing or fast food or whatever, but it just shouldn't be the way that medical treatments are presented to the public. People should consult with professionals when they are seeking these treatments instead of watching paid actors sing a song about it or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so skillfully done. I mean, next time you watch an ad, I mean, it's the same playbook every time. You know, it starts foreboding music. You know, usually if we're talking about psychiatric meds, it's a middle-aged woman. She's looking sad. She's frowning. She's looking outside at her kids playing by themselves, and she's wishing that she could be involved. And it says, do you feel a low mood? Do you have insomnia? Is your appetite low? You might be suffering from depression. One of the leading causes of disability recognized by the WHO. And then people see this and they go, oh man, I see myself in this woman. I also feel sad. I also wish I had more energy and I could play with my children. And then like the music changes and the filter on the camera changes and it says, well, did you know there's Abilify? And if you just take Abilify, it's going to make depression go away. And essentially, yeah, the music changes and then the woman is like smiling and she's running around outside with her kids and she's texting her friends and everything has gone away. It's this whole like play of like, I'm going to deeply empathize with you at the start of this and talk to you about how much you're suffering and how hard it is. And then I'm going to do this bait and switch and just say, well, if you feel that way, don't worry. We've got a drug for it and you probably have a chemical imbalance and it's FDA approved and why suffer any longer? I mean, it's the same thing every time and it does generate strong emotional responses because they're very emotional ads and they empathize with people, but then they completely mislead them.
But pharmaceutical ads by design short circuit this process. They allow big pharma companies to sell the disease, not just the cure. They convince people that they have such and such a disorder, right? That's why all these ads always start with, are you feeling this way? Do you have these symptoms? Well, then you might have this disease. Go talk to your doctor about this drug, right? They sell the disease and then they sell the drug. Enlisting the would-be patient to go to their doctor and request a drug, which is totally backwards. You know, you're supposed to go to your doctor with your symptoms, not with a wish list of drugs that you want to receive. But this is the way it works now. So pharma ads have helped to turn doctors into glorified drug dealers.
It's true.
And there's about, a dozen studies you could point to that bear this out.
Doctors hate this. So many family medicine doctors are completely burnt out. Medicine ain't what it used to be. Because then people give you bad reviews if you don't give them the drugs. I mean, it's awful.
Patients who go to the doctor and say, I saw an ad for Paxlovid or I saw an ad for Prozac are a lot more likely to get that drug than a patient who simply presents their depression-related symptoms to the doctor. And on top of that, these advertisements have also contributed to the perception that whatever problem you might have, whether it's depression or feeling like you're in the wrong body or whatever, that a drug from Big Pharma can be the solution. As we've discussed, this is a sentiment that has ruined the lives of thousands of people, including children, in this country. And part of the reason this perception has been allowed to fester, as Liz Wheeler pointed out the other day on X, is that there's no critical reporting on Big Pharma in the mainstream press. There's basically none. The pharmaceutical industry is allowed to buy billions of dollars worth of advertising, which presents them as the solution to everybody's problems. And then the press, along with many scientific institutions that also receive money from Big Pharma, don't have any incentive to contradict the narrative.
I'm going to come in here and bat for the Daily Wire and Matt Walsh. Guys, listen, you may not like Matt Walsh. I get that. Show me the other journalists that are covering these stories. Show me where they are. No one's talking about this. They're absolute cowards. They will not step out of line. They will not call out overdiagnosis, overprescription of meds. They will not call out pharmaceutical companies. And so I'm just like ranting on this. I read the comments. You go, why are you covering Matt Walsh? He's the only person who's talking about this. No one else is actually doing the right thing and covering this. And when other people cover it, I'll cover their content as well. But they're cowards. They really are. They they're afraid, and they're acting as a shield for these companies because they've been duped by the marketing. We need journalists to step out of line and actually call this out. Right now, that's only happening with Matt Walsh and the Daily Wire. He's the only one who's interested in this. If there's other people, please, by all means, drop them in the comments, and so I can react to their content as well.
If and when HHS does ban these advertisements, then suddenly that incentive will reappear. Very quickly, corporate media will fail. I mean, it will just disintegrate because they'll be deprived of most of their advertising revenue, or at least they'll be deprived of a very significant chunk of it. And in their place will be a slew of investigations by actual journalists into the various grotesque abuses of power by the medical establishment in recent years on everything from gender ideology to the COVID shot to antidepressants to everything else. Now, as of right now, again, it appears that the reports were wrong about an imminent ban on these direct-to-consumer advertisements. But there are reasons to think that RFK Jr. and HHS are still planning to implement one. And if that comes to pass, and there are indicators that it will, then it would inevitably set up a major legal battle between Big Pharma and the federal government on First Amendment grounds. They'll claim that they have the constitutional right to flood the airwaves with sales pitches for extremely potent medications that could ruin your life. But, they don't have that right. I mean, the big Pharma doesn't have a constitutional right to just access consumers whenever they feel like it in any forum that they feel like it. Any more than the local drug dealer does. So if RFK Jr. can win that fight, then in one fell swoop, he will destroy the corporate press, save billions of dollars for Americans, rescue lots of people from dangerous drugs that they shouldn't be taking, and usher in a new era of skepticism for an industry that badly needs it. He would be, easily the single most consequential HHS secretary in the history of the country, one of the most consequential cabinet secretaries, period, in the history of the country. All he needs to do is what pretty much every country in the world is already doing, which is to tell Big Pharma to get off of our televisions.
Okay. It's a shame that he's not actively pursuing this, and maybe it's in the background, because it would have huge consequences if we could do this. I do think it would. Maybe the hopeful side of me says it would tank the pharmaceutical industry, which is one of our biggest industries, and that's why this is such a probably an issue they're trying to tiptoe around at the moment. Everyone knows someone who works for the pharmaceutical industry. Even in my family, I two people in nearly my immediate family work for Big Pharma. And I'm sure that's the same for everyone. They're so wealthy and they make so much money, that, to kind of hit them in this way would cause substantial economic loss. But then we have to ask the question, do we want to privilege this industry and the jobs that they create and the money they create for their investors and their executives and the jobs over the actual health of American people? I think the answer is clear. We don't want to do that. And so we need to knock them down. We need to change things, for the health of people. That is the only right thing to do. So there you have it. That was my review. Go ahead, leave some comments below. Let me know what you think. And thank you for tuning in.